Hello everyone and welcome to the next review for John Fowles' The Tree. Now, about 2 weeks ago or so, I had the good fortune of meeting, I think for the third time, Dr. Patrick Curry, who has become a good friend of mine and a colleague. Of course, we both work for the Ecological Citizen. I was very happy to share the Chiltern Hills with Patrick. We had something of a day trip. We went to Snakemoor Nature Reserve and one of my favourite haunts, Chinner Hill Nature Reserve. At Snakemoor, I expressed a frustration in my, I suppose, perception of nature, which has been brewing for several years now. I'm no longer as immersed in the world of ecology and naturalist practice. Of course, some of you will be aware that I studied ecology officially for 5 years in 2 separate courses and worked in ecology. And obviously before that I had experiences volunteering in nature and at heritage sites and so forth. But I'm no longer as immersed in that world. And so I've had to contend with this feeling of loss, even on a surface level, not more in-depth ecological knowledge, scientific knowledge, but just the feeling of not being able to remember faces and names. So I'll be walking through a woodland and I won't immediately or at all recognise a wildflower or a bird, whatever it may be. And I expressed this frustration to Patrick, who astutely suggested that I read John Fowles' The Tree. Now, I had known John Fowles as a fiction writer. I had read The Collector, which is his first book, several years ago. A very disturbing work, but very effective. It's about fundamentally possession, which is also in many ways, the theme of this book. The Tree gives a unique insight into the writer and offers the key to a true understanding of the inspiration for his work. In this series of moving recollections involving both his childhood and his work as a mature artist, John Fowles explains the impact of nature on his life and the dangers inherent in our traditional urge to categorise, to tame and ultimately to possess the landscape. This acquisitive drive leads to alienation and an antagonism toward the apparent disorder and randomness of the natural world. For John Fowles, the tree is the best analogue of prose fiction, symbolising the wild side of our psyche, and he stresses the importance in art of the unpredictable, the unaccountable, and the intuitive. For those that are aware of Tolkien's notion of possession in his writing on fairy stories, you'll already be aware of the kinds of ideas that Fowles is writing about here. Fowles is critiquing the human drive always to know, the imperative always to control and gain some kind of yield out of nature, whatever that yield may be. In this book, he's really advocating for unarticulated experience, as he calls it, and knowing beyond names. Names can be useful, but it's fundamentally a call to return to a more relational and ineffable experience of nature. So Fowles is he's writing about almost a contrast. It's more complicated than a simple dichotomy, but he's writing about the difference between, again, wildness, or the quality of wildness, the ineffable, the mysterious, the unplumbable, versus the controllable, the need to categorize, the need to always to know and to name. And this central conflict is really brought out actually quite in loving detail and quite a nuanced way in the relationship of John Fowles and his father. John, from a very early age, begins to feel a sense of detachment from the way that his father views nature. So his father, he's overly concerned with yield, with quantification, trying to gain some use out of nature. He cultivates a garden, almost like a paradise. He cultivates apple trees and pear trees, and they are his pride and joy. And he loves nature in a sense, but it's a love of what is tamed. John Fowles, on the other hand, Fowles the younger, he sees a value in the uncontrollable and the wild side of nature. This is brought out, he says in the book, via his relatives, who are naturalists and entomologists and even big game hunters. And they very slowly make him see the value in being a naturalist, a student of nature. I just want to make a little aside here. It's quite important to me. I was very struck by this conflict between the father and the son. That central conflict is actually very similar to my own writings for Sartoris, this fantasy shared fantasy narrative that I've been constructing with my twin for many, many years. The conflict between Yaran and Daedra and Sartoris. Yaran always wanting to strike out and valuing nature, and Daedra being this figure of domination and anthropocentrism. This conflict was even actually more solidified. I found it more striking because John Fowles writes that his mother was on his side. That very much coheres with this triangle. This the conflict between Yaran and Daedra and Marissa being Yaran's mother and the wife of Daedra. Marissa is someone that instills a love of nature for its own sake into Yaran. So I just found that very pleasing how that aligned with my own writing. And indeed, Fowles' father, he sees nature as, again, something to control. He almost strives for the Platonic ideal of the strictly controlled and safe, which is, in Fowles' own words here, he wants to cultivate a Garden of Eden. He is almost afraid of what is seen as a battlefield. Wild nature is a battlefield that John Fowles' father just wants simply to master. So after describing the, I suppose, strain between himself and his father, Fowles moves on to describing a journey to Uppsala in Sweden. Now, some of you will be aware that this is the hometown of Carl Linnaeus. Linnaeus was the very earliest categorisers of nature. He really gave us this study of taxonomy. And Fowles challenges the Linnaean mindset, or Uppsalan knowledge, as he calls it. This need always to categorize and to place in boxes, to create boundaries. He calls himself a heretic about Linnaeus, and he finds nothing less strange or more poetically just than that he should have gone mad at the end of his life. I do not dispute the value of the tool he gave to natural science, which was in itself no more than a shrewd extension of the Aristotelian system, and which someone else would have soon elaborated if he had not. But I have doubts about the lasting change it has effected in ordinary human consciousness. I just want to read this next part in full because it really captures the ideas that Fowles is talking about here, and just something about his language here is very astute. Evolution has turned man into a sharply isolating creature, seeing the world not only anthropocentrically but singly, mirroring the way we like to think of our private selves. Almost all our art before the Impressionists, or their St. John the Baptist, William Turner, proclaims our love of clearly defined boundaries, unique identities, of the individual thing released from the confusion of background. This power of detaching an object from its surroundings and making us concentrate on it is an implicit criterion in all our judgments on the more realistic side of visual art, and very similar, if not identical, to what we require of optical instruments like microscopes and telescopes, which is to magnify, to focus sharper, to distinguish better, to single from the rock. A great deal of science is devoted to this same end, to providing specific labels, explaining specific mechanisms and ecologies, in short, for sorting and tidying what seems in the mass indistinguishable from one from the other. Even the simplest knowledge of the names and habits of flowers or trees starts this distinguishing or individuating process, and removes us a step from the total reality towards anthropocentrism. That is, it acts mentally as an equivalent of the camera viewfinder. Already it destroys or curtails certain possibilities of seeing, apprehending, and experiencing, and that is the bitter fruit from the tree of Upsilon knowledge. So earlier I described Fowles as being more interested in the wild side of nature, and yet he writes that when he was younger, he tended to view nature in this more categorising process, boxing everything in, despite his love of the wild. And I think I can really relate to that, especially coming out of my ecology studies. Although I'd always been interested in the humanities and the more, and I had more of a poetic cast of mind, I still nonetheless began to see nature as almost a puzzle. And Fowles captures this perfectly. He writes, I spent all my younger life as a more or less orthodox amateur naturalist, as a pseudoscientist, treating nature as some sort of intellectual puzzle, or game, in which being able to name names and explain behaviorisms to identify and to understand machinery constituted all the pleasures and the prizes. I became slowly aware of the inadequacy of this approach, that it insidiously cast nature as a kind of opponent, an opposite team to be outwitted and beaten. That in a number of very important ways it distracted from the total experience and the total meaning of nature, and not only of what I personally needed from nature, not only as I had long, if largely unconsciously, begun to feel it, which was neither scientifically nor sentimentally, but in a way for which I had, and still have, no word. I came to believe that this approach represented a major human alienation affecting all of us, both personally and socially. Moreover, that such alienation had much more ancient roots behind the historical accident of its present scientific or pseudoscientific form. Naming things is always implicitly categorising and therefore collecting them. The Collector, of course, his first fiction book, attempting to own them. And because man is a highly acquisitive creature, brainwashed by most modern societies into believing that the act of acquisition is more enjoyable than the fact of having acquired, that getting beats having got, mere names and the objects they are tied to soon become stale. Very, very Tolkienian there. So I will say that Fowles still values science. He still values the importance of names and understanding the world around you. And I think that as well. I wouldn't say I ever attempted to control or much less dominate nature, but for me, after my studies and work, I did began, even though I had that poetic cast of mind, I did see, for example, if I saw a bird, let's say a long-tailed tit, I wouldn't so much be seeing the presence or feeling the presence of this individual person, but it was for me almost an example of Aegyphalus caudatus, just an example of that species, or if I was walking through a woodland, I might think, is this a W8 woodland in the National Vegetation Classification? Walking through a heathland, I might think about podzol soil structure, or what must be done to fulfill its ecological objectives, removing pioneer trees and so forth. Walking by a river, I might think of the times where I did river habitat surveys or surveying macroinvertebrates for the Biological Monitoring Working Party methodology, calculating a score to assess the river's health. All these different, although it's valuable, in recent years I have begun to almost rebel against that side, because I feel like I had things more correct in my earlier years, when I was much more engaged in polytheism and cultural questions and living in the land and so forth. Scientific ecology, well useful, did distort my perception of nature. And that brings us on to the next part of Fowles' book. So he's talking about the dangers in seeing everything in categories and boxing everything in, but he's also critiquing use, purposiveness. Fowles writes, I think the most harmful change brought about by Victorian science in our attitude to nature lies in the demand that our relation with it must be purposive, industrious, always seeking greater knowledge. He calls it a dreadfully serious and puritanical approach. Nature becomes, for Western mankind, almost a duty, a school lesson. He goes on to talk about the far saner 18th century attitude, which viewed nature as a mirror for philosophers, as an evoker of emotion, as a pleasure, a poem. And this more humane, we could say, view of nature has been derided over the centuries. But as I hinted at earlier, as Fowles hinted at earlier, Fowles sits in a very interesting place between pragmatism and sentimentality. So even though he extols the 18th century attitude, seeing nature as an evoker of emotion, as a pleasure, a poem, and he laments a lot of this, Fowles is against overt sentimentality. There's so much in this book that I want to get across in regards to how Fowles really, he strides a line between multiple different extremes, and that's something that in many ways I always gravitate towards. It's there in Patrick Curry's writing a lot. If you read his books or seen my reviews of his books, he's between pragmatism, science and sentimentality. He's really indicating here a more humane version of our engagement with nature that blends art and science together. He writes that achieving a relationship with nature is both a science and an art, beyond mere knowledge or mere feeling alone. Interestingly, he's also between the notion of Apollonian control and Dionysian hyperunity. That's Nietzschean, but it's also that what I've just said there is Nietzschean, but Curry talks about this the two faces. One is a need for control, and the other is complete lack of control or merging. Fowles actually writes that he stopped bothering to identify species new to him. He even became interested in Zen theories of seeing and of aesthetics. But he later realised that it's impossible to live without names, if not downright idiotic, especially in a writer, he writes. And so he's always trying to grasp at something that again strides a middle way, that is relational, that requires boundaries, that sees the value in difference and otherness. But he's not he's not overtly attached to names and control and a more diagnostic mindset, but he's also not seeing nature as this he actually calls nature a free clinic for admirers of their own sensitivity. He doesn't see nature in that way either, where he's simply walking out into the woods and wanting to experience Dionysian unity in nature, this unachievable wholeness. So there's a lot here that I'm trying to get across, but I find the way that Fowles treats nature to be perfect, I think in accord with my own view of nature. So the main idea in this book is that, as Fowles writes, we have this subtle alienation from nature. It's extremely difficult to comprehend, and that is our need to use it in some way, to derive some personal yield, whatever that might be. Even pleasantness is, in a sense, a use. He writes, we shall never fully understand nature or ourselves, and certainly never respect it, until we dissociate the wild from the notion of usability, however innocent and harmless the use. For it is the general uselessness of so much of nature that lies at the root our ancient hostility and indifference to it. Fowles does lean towards the artistic, of course. He critiques, again, these attempts to explain and to make a use out of everything. He writes, devalued the kind of experience or knowledge we loosely define as art. He goes on to say that art and nature are siblings, branches of the one tree. Fowles wants to regain an appreciation of nature that is fundamentally artistic, which is rooted in the personal and the intuitive, direct experience, and accepting of mystery, ambiguity, and uselessness. But he has somewhat of a dual understanding of how art and nature are related. He holds up art as a better approach to nature, and yet he critiques it when it becomes a technique, or too formulaic, more like a science. When art becomes reproducible over original, when it favours control over expression, and when it values use over experience, that is when art becomes too much like a science. So a great part of this extended essay is comparing a walk in the woods to the way that a writer approaches a novel. A novel is it's an exercise in attaining freedom. Fowles writes that the woods are the best analogue of prose fiction. Writing a novel and walking in the woods are unstructured, unpredictable, immersive. The obsession with technique and use, and as opposed to attention and presence, is very much in line with what Curry writes about in his textbook Art and Enchantment. So there really is so much here that I want to discuss. I will try and summarise because the review is, as usual, quite long. Fowles suggests, near the end of the book, that we need to accept three things about nature. One is that knowing it fully is an art as well as a science. The second is that the heart of this art lies in our own personal nature and its relationship to other nature, never in nature as a collection of things outside us. The last is that this kind of knowledge or relationship is not reproducible by any other means, by painting, by photography, by words, by science itself. They may encourage, foster, and help induce the art of the relationship, but they cannot reproduce it any more than a painting can reproduce a symphony, or the reverse. Ultimately, they can only serve as an inferior substitute. Fowles goes on to write, to see woods and forests merely scientifically, economically, topographically, or aesthetically, not to understand that their greatest utility lies not in the facts derivable from them, or in their timber and fruit, or their landscape charm, or their utility as subject matter for the artist. All this proves the gathering speed with which we are retreating into outer space from all other life on this planet. Of course, there are scientists who are aware of this profoundest and most dangerous of all our alienations and warn us of it, or who see hopes in a rational remedy, in more education and knowledge, in committee and legislation. I wish them well in all of that, but I am a pessimist. What science and reason caused, they cannot alone cure. As long as nature is seen as in some way outside us, frontiered and foreign, separate, it is lost both to us and in us. The two natures, private and public, human and non-human, cannot be divorced, any more than nature or life itself can ever be truly understood vicariously, solely through other people's eyes and knowledge. Neither art nor science, however great, however profound, can ultimately help. I pray my pessimism is exaggerated, and we shall recover from this folly of resenting the fact that we are to all practical intents and purposes caged on our planet, or pretending that our life on it is some temporary inconvenience, in a place we have outgrown, a boarding house we shall soon be leaving, for whose other inhabitants and whose contents we need have neither respect nor concern. Scientists speak of biological processes recreated in the laboratory as being done in vitro, in glass, not in nature. The evolution of human mentality has put us all in vitro now, behind the glass wall of our own ingenuity. There is a spiritual corollary to the way we are currently deforesting and denaturing our planet. In the end, what we must defoliate and deprive is ourselves. We might as soon start collecting up the world's poetry, every line and every copy, to burn it in a final pyre, and think we should lead richer and happier lives thereafter. Fowles goes on at the very end of the book to describe a place that I've been to and studied, Wistman's Wood in Dartmoor. He describes the essential wildness of Wistman's Wood, and I think it really acts as a microcosm of what he's been saying throughout this extended essay. But I will leave that for you to read. This slim volume can be read several times, and I think you and I will always find something new within it. And so this book really is a treasure, and I'm surprised that it took me this long to read it. John Fowles, The Tree, everyone. Until next time.